We do have more to get to this morning, including the latest on the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. Today, marking 34 days since she went missing. Savannah came back here and visited everyone here in Studio 1A after yesterday's show. We're going to have more on that emotional reunion a little later for you. But first, there are new developments in the search, including the FBI investigators back canvassing Nancy's neighborhood in Tucson. NBC's Liz Kreutz has more on all of that. Liz, good morning.
Hi, Laura. Good morning to you. Yeah, investigators with both the Sheriff's Department and the FBI were back out in Nancy's neighborhood yesterday, going door to door. 3 different homeowners we spoke to told us the investigators this time were specifically asking them if they noticed any issues or disruptions with their internet service the night that Nancy went missing. They say the investigators told them that several people in the area have mentioned glitches with their internet that night. Now, neither the Sheriff's Department nor the FBI have commented on this, but I did ask the sheriff earlier this week in our interview if he believed the suspect may have had a Wi-Fi jammer on him, maybe in his pocket. All he would say is that his investigators, along with the FBI, are looking at every angle of that surveillance video. And we should also note that the homeowners we spoke to said that they were either asleep or not home, so they couldn't say if they had any issues with their internet. Meanwhile, we were back outside Nancy's home yesterday, and we continue to see people showing up, dropping flowers, paying their respects. We spoke to people who live here in Tucson and people who said they're just visiting Tucson, who wanted to come by, pray, and send a message to Savannah and her family. They still have hope and that the family is not alone. Laura.
The work continues there. Liz, thank you. And a reminder, if you have any information that could be helpful, it is not too late. We urge you to call 1-800-CALL-FBI. And again, we will have more on our reunion with Savannah and the touching messages that she shared with all of us in the next half hour.
Somewhere in America right now, an 84-year-old woman is missing. Not wandered off, not confused and lost somewhere down the street. Not a case of an elderly woman who forgot where she was going and ended up somewhere unexpected. Taken, ripped from her home in the dead of night, while the rest of her quiet, affluent neighborhood slept, while the streets outside were empty and dark and still, while nobody was watching, because whoever did this made absolutely sure of that. It has been over a month, and nobody knows where she is. Her name is Nancy Guthrie. She is someone's neighbor, someone's friend, someone's devoted churchgoer who never missed a Sunday service until the Sunday she wasn't there, and the people who noticed her absence made a phone call that set off one of the most baffling, heartbreaking, and deeply unsettling missing persons investigations America has seen in years. She is also the mother of one of the most recognizable faces on American television. And right now, as the FBI sifts through more than 40,000 leads, as reward money climbs past $1 million, as ransom notes arrive at media outlets and deadlines come and go, and a family pleads on camera with tears in their eyes for proof that their mother is still breathing, nobody has found her. This is the story of what happened to Nancy Guthrie, and the terrifying truth is, it isn't over yet. To understand why the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie hit the nation the way it did, why it spread from local Tucson news to the front pages of national outlets within hours, why the President of the United States personally ordered federal authorities to get involved, why millions of people who had never met this woman found themselves refreshing news pages at midnight hopping for an update, you have to first understand who Nancy Guthrie is, not just as a mother. Not just as a name attached to a famous daughter, but as a person, a life, a woman who had already survived more than most people ever have to endure, long before the night someone decided to take everything from her. Nancy Ellen Long was born on January 27, 1942, in Fort Wright, Kentucky. She came into the world in the middle of the Second World War, in a country that was holding its breath, and she spent her early years in a Kentucky that was still deeply rooted in the rhythms of mid-century American life. Church on Sundays, family at the center of everything, community woven tightly around you like something you could lean on when the weight got heavy. Those values, faith, family, community, would define Nancy Guthrie for the rest of her life. They were not abstract principles for her. They were the architecture of how she moved through the world. In the early 1970s, Nancy and her family made the move to Tucson, Arizona. The desert Southwest, with its vast skis and sun-bleached landscapes and the particular kind of quiet that settles over a place when the heat rises, became home. She planted herself there, raised her children there, built her life there. For more than 50 years, Tucson was Nancy Guthrie's city. She knew its streets and its seasons and its people. She was woven into its fabric the way only someone who has lived somewhere for half a century can be. Her husband was Charles Guthrie. By all accounts, he was the kind of man whose absence leaves a permanent shape in the air around the people who loved him. In 1988, when their children were still young, Charles died suddenly while on a mining exploration trip in Mexico. He was 49 years old. Nancy was left a widow alone, with 3 children to raise, in a city that was home but that had just become, in an instant, a lonelier place. She was 46 years old when she lost him, and she did what strong women do. She kept going. She raised her children, Savannah, Annie, and Cameron, with the same faith and determination and quiet resilience that had always defined her. She did not disappear into her grief. She worked through it, the hard way, the only way. Her daughter Savannah grew up in Tucson watching her mother do that, and it shaped her. You can hear it in the way Savannah Guthrie talks about her mother, the reverence in her voice, the depth of the love, the way she speaks about Nancy not just as a parent but as a force. Savannah Guthrie, 54, is today one of the most prominent journalists in America. She has been the co-anchor of NBC's Today Show since 2012, one of the most-watched morning programs in the country, a broadcast institution that has been part of the American morning ritual for decades. She is also NBC's chief legal correspondent, holds a law degree from Georgetown University, and has interviewed 3 presidents: Barack Obama, Joe Biden, Donald Trump. She has won Edward R. Murrow Awards, multiple news Emmys, and built a career defined by precision, composure, and an instinct for asking exactly the right question at exactly the right moment. But none of that, none of the career, the accolades, the decades of professionalism, could have prepared her for the phone call that came on the first day of February, 2026. The last normal night of Nancy Guthrie's life, the last night anyone who loves her saw her safe and whole, was January 31st, 2026. It was a Saturday evening, and Nancy had gone to dinner at her daughter Annie's house in Tucson. A family dinner. Ordinary, warm, the kind of evening that seems completely unremarkable in the moment and becomes unbearably precious in retrospect. At 9:48 p.m., Annie's husband, Nancy's son-in-law, Tommaso Shani, drove Nancy home and dropped her off at her house in the Catalina foothills, an affluent, quiet neighborhood roughly 6 miles northeast of downtown Tucson. He waited, as any conscientious family member would, for Nancy to get safely inside before driving away. He watched her walk through the door. He waited 2 minutes. Everything seemed fine. He left. That was the last time anyone who loves Nancy Guthrie saw her alive. The Catalina Foothills neighborhood where Nancy lived is the kind of place that doesn't expect violence. It is prosperous and orderly, the kind of neighborhood where people know their neighbors' names, where houses sit behind landscaped yards, where the streets are quiet at night and the air smells of desert sage and the distant mountains form a permanent, reassuring silhouette against the sky. It is not the kind of place where you expect someone to vanish. And yet, sometime in the deep, dark hours between 9:48 p.m. on January 31st and the following morning, someone came to Nancy Guthrie's home with a plan. A deliberate, calculated, prepared plan. And what they did in the execution of that plan tells us something profoundly disturbing about whoever is responsible for what happened next. At 1:47 a.m., the doorbell camera at Nancy's front door was disconnected. Not malfunctioned. Not lost signal due to a power outage or a technical glitch. Disconnected. Deliberately. Removed from service at a specific moment in the middle of the night by someone who knew it was there and needed it to stop recording. 41 minutes later, at 2:28 a.m., The app connected to Nancy's pacemaker disconnected from her phone. A pacemaker is an implanted cardiac device. It regulates the heartbeat of the person wearing it. The app that monitors it requires proximity to the patient's phone to maintain its connection. When that connection dropped at 2:28 a.m., it meant one of two things. Either Nancy's phone had been separated from her body, taken away, destroyed, or left behind while she was moved, or something had happened to Nancy herself. Both possibilities are terrifying. When investigators later released footage from the doorbell camera, the footage captured before it was disconnected, what they found was not the face of the person responsible. Whoever came to Nancy Guthrie's door that night was prepared for cameras. The footage shows a figure dressed deliberately and carefully, a ski mask covering the face entirely, gloves on the hands, a holstered gun visible at the hip, and a black 25-liter Ozark Trail hiker pack strapped to the back. The Ozark Trail pack is sold exclusively at Walmart. The clothing the figure was wearing was also believed to have been purchased at Walmart, a deliberate choice, investigators would later conclude, designed to make the items as difficult to trace as possible. Mass-produced, widely available, purchased for cash at a chain store with thousands of locations across the country. This was not someone who acted impulsively. This was not a random crime of opportunity. The level of preparation, the mask, the gloves, the generic untraceable clothing, the knowledge of where the doorbell camera was and how to disable it, the timing in the deepest hours of the night speaks to someone who had thought this through, planned it, possibly watched the house, possibly visited before. And that last detail, possibly visited before, is one of the most chilling aspects of what investigators subsequently uncovered. Footage and evidence suggested that the suspect had come to Nancy Guthrie's front door on at least one occasion prior to the night of the abduction. An image released by authorities showed the same figure, without the backpack this time, at the property on an earlier visit. How many days before the kidnapping that visit took place has not been fully disclosed. But the implication is clear and deeply unsettling. Whoever took Nancy Guthrie did not arrive at her address by accident. They had been there before. They had scoped it out. They had watched and waited and chosen their moment. They came back. Nobody noticed Nancy was missing until Sunday morning, when members of her church, people who knew her, who expected to see her in her usual place at Sunday service, realized she wasn't there. That detail alone says something beautiful and sad about who Nancy Guthrie was. She was the kind of person whose absence was noticed, the kind of person whose community paid enough attention to her presence that when she wasn't where she was supposed to be, people worried. They made calls. They checked. And when the calls reached her family, and the family couldn't reach Nancy and someone drove to the house and found it silent and still, that was when everything shifted. The 911 call came in at 12:03 p.m. on February 1st. Within hours, what had begun as a welfare check had become a full-scale missing persons investigation. And then, as investigators entered Nancy's home and began to look carefully at what was there and what wasn't, it stopped being a missing persons investigation and became something far more serious. Nancy's wallet was still there. Her cell phone was still there. Her car was still in the driveway. Every personal belonging that a person would take with them if they were leaving voluntarily was exactly where it should have been, untouched, undisturbed, as if Nancy had simply stepped out for a moment and would be right back. And then investigators found the blood on the floor of her porch. Tested, confirmed it was Nancy's. She had not left her home willingly. She had not wandered off in a moment of confusion or decided on a whim to go somewhere without telling anyone. She had been taken, forcibly, violently in the middle of the night from the home she had lived in for decades, in the city she had called home for more than 50 years. The Pima County Sheriff, Chris Nanos, stood before cameras and said the words that confirmed what everyone had already begun to fear. Nancy Guthrie had been abducted, taken against her will, and she was out there somewhere, an 84-year-old woman with mobility limitations, dependent on daily medication, without her phone, without her wallet, without anything, in the hands of whoever had planned carefully enough and acted boldly enough to pull this off in the dead of a quiet Arizona night. Nanos was careful with his words, but he did not soften the urgency. Nancy was not in good physical health. She needed her medication. Every hour that passed without it was an hour that put her life at greater risk. And yet, despite everything, despite the blood and the disconnected camera and the disappeared pacemaker signal and the overwhelming evidence of what had happened, Sheriff Nanos told the BBC something that has stayed with observers of this case ever since. "I just believe she's somewhere here locally," he said. "I don't know why." A seasoned law enforcement officer, decades of experience, and his gut, that instinct that good investigators develop over years of working cases, the one that whispers what the evidence hasn't yet confirmed, was telling him that Nancy Guthrie hadn't gone far, that she was still in Tucson, still nearby, close enough perhaps that someone in that city knew something, had seen something, was sitting on a piece of information that could break everything open. That belief that she was local, that this was solvable, that the answer was somewhere within reach, would drive an investigation of staggering scale. The FBI flooded in. Border Patrol joined the search. Volunteers fanned out across the desert landscape around Tucson, searching terrain that in January is cold at night and unforgiving at any hour. Tips poured in from across the country. By the time investigators publicly acknowledged the scale of what they were working through, the number had reached 40,000 leads. 40,000. Each one logged, assessed, followed up on, eliminated or pursued. It is a number that speaks to both the intensity of public interest in this case and the staggering complexity of trying to find one person in a world full of noise. And then came the ransom notes. The first communications that appeared to be connected to Nancy's disappearance arrived not directly to the family, but to media outlets. That detail is significant. It suggests a perpetrator who was watching the coverage, who understood the media landscape, who wanted maximum visibility for their demands. The FBI's Special Agent Heathjank confirmed that at least one of the notes set a deadline, a multi-million-dollar sum, demanded in Bitcoin, to be paid by February 5th. If that deadline passed without payment, the note indicated the price would go up. A second deadline of February 9th was set for an even higher figure. Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, untraceable, decentralized, designed for exactly this kind of transaction, one where the recipient wants the money without leaving a trail. The choice of payment method was another indicator of planning and sophistication. This was not someone who had grabbed an elderly woman impulsively and was now improvising. This was someone who had thought about how to get paid and how to avoid getting caught. But the ransom situation quickly became complicated in ways that made the investigation even harder. On February 6th, authorities announced they were investigating a new message. They provided no details about who received it or what it said. And then came a development that managed to be both enraging and heartbreaking at the same time: the revelation that at least one of the ransom notes was fake. A cruel, calculated fraud, perpetrated by someone willing to exploit a family's anguish for personal gain. A man in California was arrested on federal charges after investigators determined he had posed as Nancy's abductor and sent ransom demands to the Guthrie family. A scam entirely disconnected from the real kidnapping, designed to extract money from people who were already desperate and terrified and clinging to any thread that might lead them to their mother. The fake notes added a layer of chaos to an already overwhelming investigation. Which communications were genuine? Which were opportunistic frauds? How do you separate the signal from the noise when the noise is being deliberately manufactured by people trying to profit from a family's worst nightmare? Through all of it, the ransom notes, the fake leads, the dead ends, the 40,000 tips, the Guthrie family did something remarkable. They stayed public. They stayed visible. They went on camera again and again with red eyes and breaking voices and a composure that must have cost them everything, and they spoke directly to whoever had their mother. On February 4th, Savannah Guthrie looked into a camera and said, "We are ready to talk." She spoke not to the press, not to her audience, not to the millions of people watching, but directly to the person or people holding her mother. "We need to know without a doubt that she is alive and you have her." 2 days later, in a third video, the family said they had received a message. "We received your message, and we understand," Savannah said. "We beg you now to return our mother to us so that we can celebrate with her." And on February 24th, 24 days after her mother vanished, Savannah Guthrie announced the family was offering $1 million for information leading to Nancy's safe return. $1 million, on top of the $200,000 already being offered by the FBI and Tucson Crime Stoppers. A total reward that now stands at $1.2 million and climbing, a number that reflects not just wealth but desperation. The desperation of a family that has run out of things to do except keep the pressure on, keep the cameras rolling, keep the world paying attention, and hope that somewhere out there, someone who knows something will decide that $1 million is worth more than their silence. As of this moment, Nancy Guthrie has been missing for over a month. The FBI is still working the case. The sheriff still believes she is somewhere local. The family is still waiting. The reward is still unclaimed. The suspect in the ski mask and the Walmart backpack is still out there, unidentified, unarrested, unpunished. And Nancy, 84 years old, without her medication, somewhere in the dark, is still waiting too. There is a particular kind of investigation that law enforcement dreads above all others. Not the ones that are complex. Exactly, complexity can be worked through, untangled, reduced piece by piece until something clear emerges. Not even the ones that are emotionally devastating, though those take their toll in ways that never fully heal. No, the kind of investigation that truly keeps detectives awake at night is the one where everything points somewhere and nothing leads anywhere. Where the leads are real but the answers keep dissolving. Where the harder you look, the more the picture seems to shift and blur and refuse to come into focus. The investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie is that kind of case. 40,000 leads. Let that number sit for a moment. 40,000 individual pieces of information, tips called in, emails sent, messages forwarded, witnesses interviewed, surveillance footage reviewed, license plates run, social media posts flagged, and every other category of input that pours into a high-profile investigation when the entire country is paying attention, and everyone who thinks they saw something or heard something or knows something decides to pick up the phone. 40,000. It is a number that speaks to the extraordinary public interest in this case, yes, but it also speaks to the extraordinary challenge facing the FBI and the Pima County Sheriff's Department as they try to find one elderly woman in a world drowning in information. Because 40,000 leads means 40,000 things to check, 40,000 rabbit holes to go down, one by one, methodically, carefully, knowing that somewhere inside that mountain of noise there must be a single signal, a single piece of information that actually means something, that actually points somewhere real. The work of finding it is unglamorous, grinding, and relentless. It is not the dramatic breakthrough of television crime dramas. It is hours and days and weeks of elimination, ruling things out, crossing things off, narrowing and narrowing until what's left is something that might actually be true. And so far, the narrowing has produced more questions than answers. Take the gloves. In the days following Nancy's disappearance, investigators fanned out across the neighborhoods surrounding the Catalina foothills, searching for any physical evidence the suspect may have left behind. In total, they found 16 gloves discarded in the area, a number that reflects both the intensity of the search and the messy reality of investigating in a populated area, where most of what you find turns out to belong to someone entirely uninvolved. Most of those 16 gloves were determined to have been dropped by volunteers who joined the search for Nancy, people who came out in the cold Arizona nights to help look, who wore gloves against the chill, who lost one here or there in the dark. But one glove stood out, Found approximately 2 miles from Nancy's home, it bore characteristics that made investigators take it seriously. It was sent to a laboratory for DNA analysis, one of those moments in an investigation where hope quietly gathers, where the possibility of a breakthrough feels real and close. DNA is the gold standard of forensic evidence. A DNA match can crack a case wide open, connect a suspect to a scene, transform a theory into a certainty. The results came back. No match in the FBI's CODIS database, the National Offender Database that contains the DNA profiles of millions of convicted criminals and arrestees across the United States. The glove had not been worn by anyone in the system. It was a dead end. But investigators kept pulling the thread and eventually traced the glove to a local restaurant worker, an ordinary person with no connection to Nancy Guthrie, no connection to the case, no connection to anything relevant whatsoever. The glove that had briefly represented one of the most promising leads in the investigation turned out to belong to someone who simply dropped it near their workplace. But here is where it gets interesting, because while that glove led nowhere, investigators made a different discovery at Nancy's home that has not led anywhere either, but which carries a very different kind of weight. Officials confirmed that DNA evidence was found at Nancy Guthrie's address that does not belong to her or anyone known to be close to her. Unknown DNA. At the scene of an abduction. On the property of a woman who was taken from her home in the middle of the night. That DNA exists. It has been collected. It has been tested. And so far, it has not produced a match to any known individual, which means one of two things. Either the person responsible for Nancy's disappearance has no prior criminal record, no DNA profile in any law enforcement database, no history that has left a biological trace in the system, or the DNA belongs to someone tangentially connected to the scene who hasn't yet been identified and eliminated. Either way, it sits in an evidence file somewhere, a piece of the puzzle waiting for the piece it connects to. The suspect himself, the masked figure captured on doorbell camera footage, the one with the Ozark Trail backpack and the holstered weapon and the careful, deliberate movements of someone who has thought this through, remains unidentified. The FBI released the footage publicly, a decision driven by the hope that someone somewhere would recognize something. The backpack, the build, the way the figure moves. The specific way they covered the camera lens with branches, an oddly methodical, almost patient gesture that speaks to a particular kind of personality. Investigators noted that the clothing was believed to have been purchased at Walmart. The backpack was sold exclusively at Walmart. Sheriff Nanos confirmed that investigators had been reviewing surveillance footage from nearby Walmart locations, looking for a figure matching the suspect's description, the right height, the right build, buying the right items in the days or weeks before February 1st. Walmart has cameras everywhere, its parking lots, its entrances, its checkout lanes, its aisles. If the suspect walked into a Walmart in the Tucson area and bought a black 25-liter Ozark Trail backpack and a set of nondescript dark clothing, there is almost certainly footage of that transaction somewhere. The challenge is finding it, identifying which store, which date, which register, pulling the right tape from the right camera at the right moment. It is painstaking work, and it has not yet produced a public result. And then there is the detail that is perhaps the most chilling of everything investigators have uncovered, the evidence that the suspect visited Nancy Guthrie's property before the night of the abduction. An image released by authorities showed the same figure, without the backpack, at the property on an earlier occasion. The exact timing of that earlier visit has not been disclosed, but the implication is unmistakable and deeply disturbing. This person knew where Nancy lived. They had been to her home. They had stood at her door or near it at least once before the night they came back to take her. They had assessed the property, noted the camera, observed the layout, determined the best way in, the best way out, the right moment to act. This is surveillance behavior. This is the behavior of someone who treats an abduction the way a professional treats a job, with preparation, with patience, with a willingness to take the time to do it right. It raises questions that investigators have not yet answered publicly. Did anyone see this person during their earlier visit? Did any other cameras in the neighborhood capture them? Did anyone notice an unfamiliar car parked on the street, an unfamiliar figure walking past the same house more than once? In an affluent, residential neighborhood where people tend to notice things that seem out of place, did anyone notice? If they did, that information is somewhere inside those 40,000 leads, waiting to be found. The geographic scope of the investigation has extended well beyond the Catalina foothills. In the weeks following Nancy's disappearance, U.S. investigators made contact with Mexican authorities. The border between Arizona and Mexico runs roughly 60 miles south of Tucson, close enough to be relevant, far enough to complicate everything. Jurisdiction changes at that line. Legal frameworks change. The resources available to investigators and the speed at which they can operate change. The Guthrie family, unwilling to let any avenue go unexplored, reached out to a Mexican nonprofit organization that specializes in finding missing persons in the region. An acknowledgement that if Nancy had been taken across the border, the search would need resources and relationships that operate on both sides of it. A man named Carlos Palazuelos was detained in Rio Rico, Arizona, a small community approximately 60 miles south of Tucson, barely a stone's throw from the Mexican border. His home was searched, he was questioned, and then he was released after investigators determined he had no connection to the case. Another door opened, walked through, and closed. The ransom situation, meanwhile, has continued to evolve in ways that complicate rather than clarify. The FBI confirmed that at least one ransom note was definitively fake, a fraud perpetrated by a California man who was subsequently arrested on federal charges. But the existence of fake notes does not mean all the notes are fake. Somewhere in the stack of communications that have arrived at media outlets and law enforcement offices and the Guthrie family's representatives, there may be, investigators believe there is, at least one genuine message from whoever actually has Nancy. The challenge is authentication. Separating the genuine from the fraudulent when everyone knows the details of the case. When the story has been covered so extensively that anyone with a keyboard and a cruel imagination could construct a plausible-sounding ransom demand. The FBI's Special Agent Heathjank confirmed the existence of a note that set specific deadlines and demanded a specific sum, millions of dollars, payable in Bitcoin by February 5th, with a higher figure due by February 9th. Those deadlines passed. What happened when they passed, whether the family paid, whether negotiations occurred, whether the absence of payment triggered any response from the abductor, has not been publicly disclosed. Law enforcement does not typically reveal the details of active ransom negotiations, for obvious reasons, but the family's public statements offer clues. On February 6th, Savannah Guthrie stood in front of a camera and said something remarkable. "We received your message," she said, looking directly into the lens as if making eye contact with the person holding her mother, "and we understand." She did not say what the message contained. She did not say whether the family had paid or intended to pay or was in communication through back channels. She said only that they understood, and then she did the most human thing possible. She begged. "We beg you now to return our mother to us so that we can celebrate with her." That word, celebrate, carries a specific, pointed meaning. It is not the word you use when you are resigned to a bad outcome. It is not the word of someone who has given up hope. It is the word of someone who still believes that the story can end differently. That somewhere on the other side of whatever transaction or negotiation or miracle needs to happen, there is a version of events where Nancy Guthrie comes home, where she sits at a table with her children and her grandchildren, and the people who love her, and the word celebrate means exactly what it's supposed to mean. Savannah Guthrie is a journalist. She has spent her career choosing words with precision. She knows what she's saying when she says them, And when she said celebrate, speaking to the person holding her 84-year-old mother, speaking to the cameras, speaking to the country, she was not performing hope. She was insisting on it. President Donald Trump, who ordered federal authorities to assist in the investigation, called the case very unusual. It is a characterization that, stripped of political context, is simply accurate. This case is unusual. Elderly victims are not the typical targets of sophisticated, planned abductions. The level of preparation involved the surveillance visits, the camera disabling, the untraceable clothing, the cryptocurrency ransom demand, suggests a perpetrator with resources, patience, and a specific reason for choosing Nancy Guthrie. Was she chosen because of her daughter's fame and presumed wealth? Was she chosen because of something more personal, some connection or grievance that has not yet come to light? Was she chosen randomly, because she lived alone and seemed vulnerable, and the house seemed manageable? Sheriff Nanos has not ruled out the involvement of an accomplice. One person can abduct an 84-year-old woman, but moving her, hiding her, managing a location where she is being held, monitoring her health, communicating with her family, all of that becomes considerably more complex for a single individual operating alone. The involvement of a second person would explain some of the operational sophistication of what has unfolded. It would also mean that two people are carrying the secret of where Nancy Guthrie is, and secrets, when shared, are harder to keep. Every additional person who knows the truth is another potential weak point. Another person who might, under the right circumstances, decide that the reward money is worth more than loyalty. $1.2 million. That is what Nancy's safe return is worth in public reward money right now. $1 million from the family, $200,000 from the FBI and Tucson Crime Stoppers. It is a life-changing sum for almost any ordinary person, and it is sitting there, unclaimed, waiting for whoever has the information that cracks this case open. Somewhere in Tucson, because that is still what Sheriff Nanos believes, still what his gut is telling him after weeks of working this case, Nancy Guthrie is waiting too. An 84-year-old woman who survived widowhood at 46 and raised 3 children alone in the Arizona desert, and attended church every Sunday for decades, and never gave anyone a reason to wish her harm. A woman whose daughter grew up watching her strength and built a career on the values her mother modeled. A woman who went to dinner at her daughter's house on an ordinary Saturday evening in January and never came home. She is out there, in a room somewhere or a building somewhere, or a place that the 40,000 leads and the DNA evidence and the Walmart surveillance footage and the ransom notes and the gloves and the doorbell camera footage have not yet managed to locate. She is dependent on medication she doesn't have. She is in the hands of someone who covered their face and brought a gun and planned everything carefully enough to pull this off without leaving a trace that has yet been found. And the people who love her are still on camera, still begging, still waiting for a phone to ring or a door to open or a tip to come, and that changes everything. Savannah Guthrie paused her career, the career that took decades to build, the career her mother watched her build from this very city, to be present for whatever comes next. To be in Tucson, close to the investigation, close to the place where her mother was last seen. To be ready when the call finally comes, to run toward it. Because it has to come. That is what the family is holding onto. That is what the investigators are working toward every single day. That is what $1.2 million in reward money is saying to whoever out there has the answer. It has to come. Nancy Guthrie has been missing for over a month. The desert around Tucson is cold at night and vast and full of places where a person could be hidden. But it is also full of people. People who drive its roads and work its businesses and live in its neighborhoods and notice things. People who may have seen something, a car, a face, a building with its lights on at the wrong hour, and not yet understood what they saw. To those people, the Guthrie family has one message. The same message Savannah has been delivering over and over, with red eyes and a breaking voice, and the kind of love that does not know how to stop. Come forward, tell someone, pick up the phone. Because somewhere out there, an 84-year-old woman is waiting to come home. And her family is waiting to celebrate. This has been the story of the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie as it stands today. The investigation is active and ongoing. As of the time of this recording, Nancy has not been found. If you have any information about her whereabouts, please contact the FBI or the Pima County Sheriff's Department.